colonialism is not even necessarily fully unequivocally good for the people who are colonizing long term, because it creates overreach. When you have overreach, that has consequences in all sort of ways. When you extend resources to these colonial projects that actually impoverish your country at home, Britain, for example, which is with its overreach, led to it having to tax its population more and more, and that obviously led to problems for it.
Simple
Endeavors
way
of that too.
of putting it is, if the only way that you can hold on to a colony is by creating an extractive narrow elite that mediates your power and control in that place, then that colony will not get very rapid economic growth as a consequence of that. And therefore, you will have to throw too much resources and money at either militarily controlling the colony or paying off this local elite to do this work for you. And this means that you won't get the kind of growth that you would need to really benefit from holding the colony for any great length of time in the first place. And this can, not be a great money loser necessarily, but it also can be not a great money winner. It can just be something that where the colony doesn't grow as fast as it otherwise could, and you also don't benefit a lot from holding it. And it just
Right.
puts you in a situation where now you have a lot of territory and you don't have a whole lot of development in that territory. So a lot of the territory is vulnerable potentially to outside incursion or to any sort of internal conflict that gets going. Acemoglu and Robinson, by the way, they had a follow-up book called The Narrow Corridor.
I've been reading that. I
Right.
posted
In
about it.
which they recommend, their recommendation is to have a balance between disorder and centralization. An overly centralized polity will be too extractive. It will have too narrow and too closed an elite. There won't be any competitive mechanisms, and therefore there won't be any dynamism. But if there's no level of centralization, then you have disorder and chaos and anarchy.
Yeah.
So what you need is a kind of managed competition, which requires centralization over a certain minimum threshold, not
Mm-hmm.
beyond a certain threshold.
Right.
And the difficulty is when you're confronting anarchy, you go, the answer is centralization, and you
Yes.
run all the way in that direction. And then when you confront the problem of centralization, you go, the answer is competition, and you go all the way in that direction. But can you actually manage to stay within a moderate range between those two procedural and institutional poles? It's a quite difficult thing to actually pull off because it's not simply something you can do with formal constitutional assent.
That's why they call it the narrow corridor, right?
Right.
And this is like why they're so big on institutions, because you can it's not about policy, because you can recommend the IMF can recommend whatever policies, whatever economists can recommend whatever policies. If the elites don't have an incentive to implement policies that are good, I mean, they're not going to do it. There's this weird myopic narrative that some people on the left believe, and in many ways it's really self-defeating and wrong, which is this idea that the quote unquote West, which is already a problematic category to generalize, got rich because of colonialism. But it's obviously just if you would have to not read any Adam Smith or Marx to believe that. You not understand the advent of bourgeois society and what that meant. But
How
like
do
a
you
perfect
establish colonies? Because you have some military or economic advantage to start with. You couldn't establish colonies without an advantage to begin with.
Exactly. They did that because they had the power to do so anyway. But the important thing, that's another point that Why Nations Fail makes. I mean, it's why did England get so rich and Spain and Portugal didn't? Right? Like that's an important question. These are at the time Spain had more colonial control than even England did, right?
Right.
Yet but England got very rich because it had inclusive institutions. It was able to balance its elite conflict in the way that you couldn't in other countries. When
Yeah,
you get
you
elite.
can't, by saying the West got rich through imperialism, you can't answer questions about why some Western states got richer than others. And you also can't answer questions about why did the system of imperialism fall apart? Why was there decolonization? Well, decolonization could only happen because the system of imperialism did not just continuously enrich these states such that they got exponentially stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. No, if that were the case, if that's how it worked, then you wouldn't have had decolonization in the first place. So the process of colonialism doesn't have some sort of ever enriching effect. And the way in which you set up an empire and operate it is very consequential. And there are lots of different kinds of institutional dynamics in different kinds of imperial states. And not all empires are the same. They're not simply core periphery extraction arrangements. This is a superficial reading.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I am here again with my regular co-host, technically, of this new show we basically have, the One Dime Studebaker show. I'll let maybe people in the audience determine what the name will be. I don't think we're going to go with Studebaked. But yeah, we've been doing so many shows together at this point, we decided to kind of make it a monthly or every 2 weeks sort of thing. And in this episode, we're going to be discussing a few things that are contemporary and a few things that are ever present, really evergreen, important topics in politics. The first is Venezuela. What is happening between the US government and the government of Venezuela? What are the Trump administration's plans? Is there regime change? What is even going on with Maduro's government? There seems to be a lot of confusion in the way people talk about this. What are the motives of the US? Also, this is an interesting way to talk about the sort of political history of Venezuela and the challenges of petrol states more broadly, and even further, the challenges of decolonization, which I think is very important because a lot of people on the left, even people on the right, sometimes will be for decolonization. Sounds great. But what does that look like? What about the governments that come after? How do you govern a post-colonial government, society? I mean, these are all tough questions, and sometimes we like to ignore it. We like to look at the spectatorship of the spectacle, of revolution, of overthrow, but not what comes after. And we're going to talk about all that today. But first and foremost, Benjamin Studebaker, need no introduction, political theorist at Cambridge, author of 2 books, yada, yada, you know the deal. What are your first initial thoughts that you would like to get into with regard to this Venezuela situation as it stands
Yeah.
now?
So I think it's an opportunity for people to think a bit about petrol states, states where oil or some other kind of mineral resource that's tied to territory becomes a large part of the economy of a state. So when this happens, you have a kind of source of wealth that's territorial. A lot of states have large economic sectors that are not so territorial, where in principle, if that state were to lose its competitive advantage, then the business could go somewhere else. So for instance, if you become very bad at making computer chips, somebody else can start making computer chips somewhere else, potentially. If you become, very bad at making cars, somebody else somewhere else can make cars. But when you're dealing with minerals, there's a territoriality that gives a seeming advantage to military and state actors, because military and state actors can seize territory and control it. And if you control the area, the land area, or the coastline area where the oil is, then you control the wealth. So it's simply a question of force over territory. This makes these states more like old-fashioned agrarian states from a long time ago, when the basis of wealth was farmland, agriculture. If you control the land, then you control the wealth. So military power to control territory was very directly connected with wealth. So there's a tendency for petrol states to be more militarized and for control of the military to be much more immediately relevant to the way the entire economy operates. Because if parts of the military become discontented, then there's a possibility of simply seizing the oil wells, just taking them, taking the physical space where they are and controlling them. And by doing that, controlling the oil wealth. Now, because of this, there is also this problem of seemingly you've got the oil wealth. So why should you give any of the wealth that's produced from the oil wells to anyone who doesn't come from your country? Why should you give it to anybody else? You physically control it. So why shouldn't you simply distribute the revenue from the oil to your supporters domestically, whoever they might be? And so your supporters go, this is a resource that we have that can't run away from us. It's locked in a location. We control the location where the resource is. So why can't we simply have the money that the resource generates and have it immediately? So there's an immediate demand on any petrol state that it give the proceeds of the oil wealth to its support base, whatever that support base is. It can be a working class support base. It can be a section of the elite. It can be some big royal family. Whoever it is that is the support base for the regime, these people go, give us the wealth. Give it to us. Give it to us now. Why should we wait? It's right here, and it can't run away if we take it all and use it all. There's not going to be capital flight. The oil isn't going to get up and run off and go somewhere else. So one of the consequences of this is that petrol states face this pressure to not invest the wealth in a long-term way, but to instead immediately spend it. And this pressure tends to be stronger if the support base for the government is the poor, because the poor have immediate material needs that the oil wealth can immediately meet. So if you are a petrol state, but you have a relatively large population of relatively poor people, there's going to be a big pressure on you to legitimate your regime by making immediate interventions to alleviate poverty. If you do this, then there are consequences that follow from this. One is that the foreign states that want an opportunity to make money from your oil will be mad at you for denying them this opportunity and for instead giving all of your oil wealth to your own population. These people will invest less in developing other industries in your country, so you'll get less foreign direct investment. Secondly, you're going to have this problem of not being able to use the oil money yourself to invest in developing other industries and sectors in your country because you're using the oil wealth to placate your support base, right? So you don't get foreign investment in new industry, and you can't invest in your new industry because you're tied up in making expenditures. And then the third thing is that the oil price is not a stable thing. The oil price goes up and down, which means the amount of resources that you have available to distribute will fluctuate rapidly. But if you have permanent social programs, education programs, healthcare programs, welfare benefits, permanent programs, permanent expenses, then your capacity to fund those expenses is going to vary wildly depending on the global oil price. And no petrol state is so large that it can determine the global oil price by itself. So it was for this reason that oil states, petrol states, got together to make OPEC. OPEC is a cartel of oil states who try to influence the price of oil. Now, usually a cartel that tries to control the price is considered a bad thing or something that is regarded as an anti-market, uncompetitive, blah, blah, blah. But everybody tolerates OPEC. And the reason that everybody tolerates OPEC is that because petrol states use their oil revenues to buy off parts of their population so that they can remain in power, it's necessary to legitimate these regimes to the population. And therefore, some level of price stability with regard to the oil price is necessary for petrol states to have political stability. And if petrol states don't have political stability, then the price of oil will likely go up over time even more and be an even bigger problem for all of the consumers of oil. So the consumers of oil tolerate the existence of OPEC because they benefit from the existence of OPEC insofar as it leads to more political stability in petrol states. But one of the things that happened that was very disruptive in the last 20 years was the discovery of shale oil in the United States and in Canada. This shale oil first dramatically reduced the price of oil initially when it was first found and first drilled. The fracking oil dramatically reduced oil prices. This was destabilizing, and there was only so much OPEC could do about it because it's the United States, it's Canada, it's countries that are not petrol states. They have large economies. Most of their economies are not oil. So even though they have a lot of oil, enough oil to be significant in terms of the global oil price, these countries don't think like petrol states because they have large economies with many different sectors that are quite productive. So these countries are not sitting here and thinking, oh, what we really have to do is manage the oil price so that we can get the most out of this shale oil. It's only a handful of states and provinces in Canada and the United States that are really heavily affected by the shale oil. The vast
Alberta.
bulk of both economies is insulated from the effects by the diversity of other sectors that operate. So the United States and Canada didn't care about trying to make sure that the oil prices were stable. They went, here's a great opportunity to rely less on petrol states for oil and gas and to have more control over our energy. Isn't this great? Doesn't this actually give us a lot more foreign policy independence now because we don't have to care so much about petrol states and their needs and their internal stability and internal security, right? It also meant that these states became less concerned in general about climate change and about energy because now they had substantial parts of both of the states making a significant amount of money from drilling oil. The effect of all of this is that oil prices were volatile, they went down, and then a lot of petrol states were put under stress by this, put under political stress by it. Now, the war in Ukraine pushed oil prices back up again. And the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine in combination changed the situation and created a moment where there was serious demand for oil that wasn't being met. So when it comes to Venezuela, the United States initially was quite pleased to have all of this fracking oil and gas and to therefore not need to be so fussed about Venezuela and to be able to put extra pressure on Venezuela. So during the Obama administration, all of this fracking and drilling got going. And then in the first Trump administration, they went and put lots of pressure on Venezuela. Then COVID happens, the Ukraine war happens, there's disruption to the Russian delivery of oil and gas into Europe. The Europeans are forced to buy liquefied natural gas from North America. And in general, there's an upward pressure on oil prices that's coming from all of it. What happens is that the Biden administration backs off on Venezuela because now there's a need for oil. And so what happens is that all of these people in Venezuela who were told that the United States was going to help them overthrow Maduro, these people are left hanging out to dry. So the Biden administration goes, hey, we don't want to betray you. We are not looking to make you unsafe, but we do have to back off on this for now because of the change in the oil price. So, okay, if you come to the United States and you're from Venezuela, you can stay. Don't worry about it. If you're concerned about something going on because we didn't finish getting rid of Maduro, just come to the United States and you can stick around. So they have this very relaxed policy
Border
of taking
policy.
Venezuelans. And a huge number of people from Venezuela come to the United States as a consequence of this.
We should say this. So when people say Biden had open borders, they didn't really have open borders, but there was a period where they did kind of when it came to the exodus of Venezuelans. Like there was
And this also had to do with the COVID labor shortage, right? So there's this perception that there's a labor shortage, Americans are staying home. So there needs to be some more people anyway. And not just the United States. The UK under Boris Johnson did this. It wasn't just a Biden, Democrat, liberal thing. Conservative governments also did this, also relaxed things and took people to try to alleviate the labor shortage during the pandemic, right? So all of these Venezuelans come. Now the situation is stabilized again. The oil prices come back down. It's come back down quite a ways. If you go buy gas in the United States, it's relatively cheap, especially when you think of all the inflation that's occurred. It's quite remarkably cheap right now, gas in the States. So now there's an opportunity again to put pressure on Venezuela because there doesn't need to be so much oil and gas. In fact, if the oil price gets too low, then the shale oil becomes less competitive. The oil that's drilled in the United States and in Canada is relatively expensive to drill. So it only becomes really profitable to drill it when the oil price, the global oil price, is over a certain threshold. So if the oil price gets to be beneath that threshold, then those oil companies go out of business or they stop operating in those regions, or they have to be propped up by the government to continue to operate at a loss in those regions. So therefore, there's an incentive now to get the oil price back up a little bit. And since there's an incentive to get the oil price back up a little bit, there's actually an incentive to potentially cause a certain amount of trouble in petrol states. And because there's been a longstanding bipartisan desire to get rid of Maduro in Venezuela, there's therefore an opportunity to put pressure on the Venezuelan government. Now, there are claims that have been made about the Venezuelan government participating in drug trafficking. And these claims are made by people in the Trump administration, and they're also denied. The Venezuelan government denies them. And some people in the media claim that they're totally fabricated. And then there are some people who say that, who have a kind of in-between position. They'll say, well, yes, the Maduro government participates to some degree in drug trafficking, but you can't know that the particular boats that are being attacked by the Trump administration have anything to do with that. You certainly can't be sure about that. Of course, we don't have direct access to the intelligence that's being used to make these decisions, so we can't really adjudicate these claims. We can just notice that different claims are being made and that they're contradictory.
And the way it's supposed to work is that you detain the drug traffickers, you give due process, and then you convict them. But he's just out here, striking the boats, so we don't really, before we really know if these are drug traffickers or not.
And this
So
is
it's
a consequence of how the War Powers Resolution from the 70s combines with the counterterrorism policies of the Bush administration to make it such that if the United States can stage a military operation without deploying troops, it's extremely easy for the president legally to get away with doing it now. Because the War Powers Resolution allows the president to just decide that military action is necessary, as long as there's not a troop deployment that exceeds a unit of time. And since the 70s, the military has become more and more drones, missiles, stuff that you can deploy remotely. The amount that the president can do without having to deploy troops for a unit of time that exceeds the War Powers Resolution has expanded and expanded and expanded. And then the counterterrorism powers also allow the administration to make claims about groups being terrorist organizations that are difficult to challenge or adjudicate in the courts. And it's possible that there may be legal challenges that are able to curtail this or shrink it to some degree. But part of why he's getting away with this so far, to the degree that he is that there haven't been any proper tests, really, of the limits of how far the government can label something a terrorist organization. And a lot of the Bush administration officials who crafted all of this language are claiming now that it's being abused. But this has to be proven out in court. So we'll see. I think part of the reason these Bush administration officials are going public with this is that they're hoping to shape the way in which courts interpret the language. If the Bush administration officials make it clear that it wasn't their intention or their understanding of the language at the time that they wrote it, that it would be used this way, that's one of the kinds of arguments that can potentially be coughed up. But the originalists on the Supreme Court are not explicitly concerned with the intentions of the people who wrote the law. They're concerned with what the language in the law meant at the time that it was written. And it seems plausible to me that many Bush administration officials wanted, at the time that they were writing it, to write it in such a way that they could do what they wanted to do and couldn't really imagine that somebody would use it to do this. That wasn't really in their
Right.
imaginarium.
That's, of
So-
course, what everyone warned about, which is this terrorism category is so nebulous, it could be stretched to infinitely expand the state. I mean, this is why everyone was freaking out about, George Bush, I would say, is, expanded federal power more than any other president in modern history, in U.S. history, that is. I want to just ask a clarifying question before we can get back to Venezuela, though. So you mentioned the 73 War Powers Resolution. Wasn't that designed to, like, limit the presidential power? Because from what I recall in the Schlesinger, Imperial presidency, it was like Truman who first allowed for the U.S. president to go to war without congressional approval. That was the Korean War. And then the War Powers Resolution was designed to kind of limit that. So
yeah, it
what's going?
seems that way. But what the War Powers Resolution did was it codified that some of the things that were of nebulous legality that were going on were legal. So in principle, the argument at the time was, how can the U.S. president conduct any military operation without a declaration of war? Isn't any military operation without a declaration of war illegal warfare? In the case of Korea, they could point to a UN authorization. So they could claim that there was an international law basis for Korea. But without a declaration of war and without a UN authorization, what would be the legal basis for the U.S. president deploying military force? The War Powers Resolution creates a legal basis. It circumscribes it, so it qualifies it, but it regulates something that was effectively already taking place. The hardline hippie position, if you're really anti-war and anti-U.S. president using military powers, then your claim would be that there shouldn't be any situation in which the president can deploy military force without UN authorization or congressional authorization or both. But the War Powers Resolution gives the president the legal authority to do this, provided he does it within a set of constraints. And those constraints were written with 70s military technology, tactics, strategy in mind. So they were written on the premise that there's only so much you can really do with an air force. Ultimately, if you really want to control territory, you need tanks on the ground, armored divisions on the ground. And therefore, the military technology itself sets a brake on what can be done. So if you say the president can't deploy troops for more than, I don't remember the exact number of days, 60, 70, 80, 90, something like that, right? The military technology itself constrained what could be done within that time frame. And Donald Rumsfeld during the Bush administration was a huge proponent of air power because he believed technology was advancing to the point where large-scale troop deployments might not be necessary anymore. And this didn't quite come off. They ended up having to do the surge and deploying more ground troops in Iraq than they really wanted to deploy. And they had to do this because the Air Force and the missile and drone technology wasn't quite ready for prime time. They couldn't really effectively control the territory without boots on the ground. And this was frustrating for them because they felt like they were close to being able to do a lot more with a lot less U.S. troops. The goal, really, and this goes all the way back to Vietnamization at least, for the U.S. military, has been to conduct military operations without any American ground troops being necessary. Because if you can conduct military operations without any American ground troops, then you don't need congressional authorization to do anything. Once you're at a point where you can declare anybody to be a terrorist organization that you want, and you can hit them without deploying any ground troops, now you are really, really able to do an enormous amount of stuff per the way the law is currently written. Now, Congress could always respond to what the president is doing and change the War Powers Resolution to update it, to take all of this into account. But Congress isn't doing that. And the critics of the administration aren't looking for Congress to do that. They're making arguments in terms of the civil servants and the generals should be objecting, and the media should be demanding an explanation, and people should be taking the administration to court potentially over what it's doing. There isn't a claim here that Congress should reassert its capacity to constrain what the executive can do by amending all of this legislation. Nobody's arguing that in the elite circles where this stuff is being discussed. There are people, of course, in the online space, regular people who make these kinds of arguments, but not anybody who's in position to potentially prevail.
So originally I was thinking of starting with what is currently happening with the Venezuela situation, but I think, decided to go more to the history of what has led to the present moment. And since we're on that trajectory anyway, we might as well present it this way. And there's some details in what you described there I think are also worth adding when it comes to Venezuela. So, obviously, for those who don't know, the current regime that's in power in Venezuela is the result ultimately of the Bolivarian revolution that brought Hugo Chavez to power, military general, though it was, largely democratic in how he got to power with a lot of popular support. And Chavez, I would simply describe as a classic Caesarist figure in that he was popular, got a lot of initial popular because he did genuinely popular things. But he was a very, militarist sort of figure, charismatic, concentrated a lot of power. But he used Venezuela's large oil reserves to alleviate a lot of poverty, at least in the short term. In the short term, he
Yes.
really did bring down Venezuelan poverty significantly.
With the petrol handcuffs. So when
Mhm.
you do poverty reduction with oil money and you set up permanent long-term programs to do poverty reduction with oil money, and you don't develop other economic sectors with that oil money, then as soon as there's fluctuation in the oil price, all of your
Mhm.
social welfare programs are vulnerable. And this is why Venezuela has the inflation that it's had. This is why
Mhm.
there's so much instability. The issue is that poverty reduction was done in an unsustainable way by relying specifically on the oil sector and not diversifying the economy. And of course, to diversify the economy when you're a small state in Latin America, and Venezuela is not a tiny state, but it's a medium-sized, not great power level state, requires ultimately getting other states to cooperate with you, which means having a domestic policy, potentially an oil policy that those other states like. And this is the classic conundrum. If the petrol state agrees to let the foreign investors have some of the oil money, the foreign investors will give some foreign direct investment. But if that isn't the case, then they won't give that foreign direct investment, which means now there will be more pressure on you to use the oil money to alleviate the poverty that is around. And
Mhm.
you'll have a harder time persuading your population to put that off while you develop other parts of the economy. And completely understandably, why would very poor people put up with a claim that you have to wait 20 or 30 years to get poverty alleviation while we grow other parts of the economy? Why would people in a desperate or difficult situation accept that? Of course, they won't accept it. But then if you concede to them and you do use the oil money to make their lives better, what will then happen is that as soon as the oil price drops, all of this will be set on fire. It's an incredibly hard situation, and there's
Mhm.
no easy path. The people who opposed this in Venezuela lost to Chavez precisely because they were ignoring the poverty, the immediate poverty, and trying to do some sort of long-term growth strategy. And how does this look to the ordinary people in the country? It looks like you are giving the oil money away to foreigners,
Mhm.
and you're giving it away to cronies in the business sector. And a lot of this, of course, does happen. A lot of this happens along the way to trying to invest in other sectors of the economy. So, of course, a government which tries this strategy looks, and it often is, to varying degrees, corrupt and in bed with imperialists and all of that. So, there isn't a very good strategy available to a petrol state with the level of poverty that Venezuela had at the point at which all of this was being debated and fought over in the 90s and 2000s.
Right. And with Chavez, there was a coup attempt on him famously by under the George W. Bush administration. It failed. Actually, largely, was defended through popular revolt in many ways. Like,
Mhm.
Chavez still had lots of support at this time. The Bolivarian Revolution was still something a lot of Venezuelans believed in at the time. And you had like mass popular support. Yes, you did have concentration of power, but you did have legitimacy in the government in a way that the coup totally failed. And at the same time, there also wasn't this ability to do maximum pressure sanctions because, the you still couldn't like sanction Venezuelan oil internationally without consequences that would hurt a lot of countries. But as you mentioned, with the discovery of more oil, that changes the picture a lot. And with really like two things that shift, is the discovery of new oil in North America and also another big legitimation crisis with Maduro as Chavez dies and Maduro takes power. There's already this issue, right, where you're starting to see like hyperinflation due to the fact that you're importing food using foreign currency that you got selling oil. And when you rely on foreign currency, naturally speaking, like not just you're going to be prone to all the price fluctuations of that. And that means like more expensive those imports get, right? And the prices are just going to hike dramatically. And Venezuela had a crazy inflation spike. I've talked about this a little bit in some of the episodes I did with some MMT economists talking about what happened in Venezuela. But a lot of this is also kind of explained by a really classic book I like to recommend a lot of people who are new to political economy. It's How Nations Fail. It's a kind of classic book, but it talks about extractive industries and how, it might be easy to rely on extractive industries, but they're bad for all kind of reasons. One, they're unsustainable, and they also create very bad incentives for elites because what it does is you create an elite around that extractive industry that will not have an incentive to invest in other industries that could diversify the economy because that's directly damaging to their power. And what
Right.
you sort of get then is a patronage system, right? Where, you have that industry is tied to an elite and that elite concentrates power. That elite is opposed to diversifying the economy that could help the country. And then it's really hard to outgrow that. And by the way, this is not just Venezuela. This is a big problem in a lot of the former colonies of Latin America in general, like of Spain, the former Spanish and Portuguese colonies. It was a big problem that was very hard to get out of that. In
Yeah.
Venezuela is just a particular case because that extractive industry was taken over by a, quote unquote socialist government that planned to use that for the people and did, but then it ran into the same problem. Now, with this legitimacy crisis that comes with, a declining economy, also, Chavez dying and Maduro ultimately not having that charisma that Chavez had or that legitimacy, he's not able to actually convincingly win an election. So the 2015 election, whether that's rigged, I see more that is more actually contestable than the more recent election looks much more obviously rigged, in my opinion. The 2015 one's super dodgy, but it's, you know, the evidence is all over the place from what I've seen. But basically, it's not a very convincing election, and it's not one that secures legitimacy. You have people across the board saying that it's rigged. You also have persecution of opposition in a way that's more aggressive, more media censorship that's more overt. This gives impetus for the EU to now be on board with international sanctions, and enforcing those sanctions, which really cripples the Venezuelan economy to, another degree.
Yeah.
And not to mention, we can get into this after, but like this has like creates basically a refugee crisis. So this is the kind of big irony of, I think, the Trump administration and honestly just the US government period is a complaint about mass immigration, but also being very much at the forefront of exacerbating the conditions that have led to that, which is like making the conditions even worse in Venezuela that have created now a mass exodus of, refugees, but also illegal migrants, because that's like you could say there was a first early wave of legal migrants. I actually knew some in Canada. I can tell the story after about one of the first time I ever heard anything about Venezuela was in 2014. But more recently, you had this exodus of people coming desperately trying to flee. But then now you have the border crisis. But it's like, what is causing this? I think this is all important to highlight, right?
And the turnover in leaders allows some of this to be mystified. So, the fact that you get to Maduro and that Chavez doesn't quite last long enough for all of the economic crises to be attached to Chavez, allows people to feel like maybe the problem isn't the system fundamentally, but just Maduro. And in the same way, with the Trump and Biden administrations, the reason that the Biden administration ended up taking all of these Venezuelans is that the Trump administration had adopted a pressure strategy that the Biden administration was then forced to abandon by changes in the oil market globally. And then the Trump administration blames the Biden administration for this, when if the Trump administration had been in power, almost certainly it would have done the same thing. And we can surmise this not just because of the material situation and the incentives and interests it kicks up, but also we can look at somebody like Boris Johnson, who talked a bunch of stuff about immigration. And then when he's in power in a situation like this, changes all of his positions to try to economically survive the period. Because ultimately, he's not going to win the election if the economy seems to be doing very badly. And if he thinks that he can prop up the economic numbers and stay in office by taking a significant number of immigrants or refugees on, he will do that. And so by the same token, I think Trump was very likely to have done the same thing if he were in charge. But because he wasn't, he now gets to frame himself as cleaning up a mess, which was itself the result of his own behavior.
You also get this huge problem, which is there's a legitimacy crisis in Venezuela. You get increasingly Maduro relying on the military to keep order, because there's coup attempts, right? And the lack of legitimacy that you have, the more you can't rely on the people to defend the regime change. Because this is the thing about regime change we have to know. This is the brutal reality. Like, regime change is not just so easy. You can't just there's this fantasy in some people's heads that you can just the US can topple any regime it wants. You can only really topple a regime that has a big lack of legitimacy at a certain point and a crisis.
To tie it back into that war powers resolution stuff, if you deploy U.S. troops to occupy Venezuela, then you'll need congressional authorization for use of force, which you won't get, because then you'll have a big public debate about whether we should do that, and people will not vote to do that in the United States. So therefore, you need people in Venezuela to do the actual work.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is the thing. It's not to the stage yet where the United States can conduct military operations completely without any ground troops. But it is potentially to the stage where the United States can conduct military operations with other countries' people serving as the ground troops, with American support from the sky. So the Vietnamization strategy, the strategy of trying to make the South Vietnamese be the ground troops so that the Americans could leave, that is a strategy that the United States has continued to try to deploy in subsequent conflicts. But each time with the technology having shifted a little bit in a way that makes it a little bit easier to pursue that kind of strategy. So in the case of Iraq or Afghanistan, it was a little bit easier to imagine that you might have Iraqis or you might have Afghan soldiers doing the brunt of the work. The problem in both cases is that they were not able to produce an Iraqi or Afghan army that was committed and motivated to defend the state that the Americans created.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that mean? It means that the level of intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan through ground troops was still excessive. The fact that that intervention seemed to the Americans to be necessary indicated that the Americans didn't have enough support in Iraq or in Afghanistan to actually pull off the regime change in a sustainable way. So now the question is, can you create a pressure cooker situation that gets the population in the country to start doing the work? And then if the population in the country is doing the work, then you can help them out from the sky. And you saw that done in Libya. So in Libya, there was no large-scale deployment of U.S. ground troops, and therefore no need for Barack Obama to seek out congressional use of force, right? But they were able to, by attacking from the air, the Gaddafi forces, produce a situation in which the Gaddafi forces, who otherwise were projected to win the engagements, lost those same engagements. So in doing this, they were able to flip the situation in favor of the rebels. And this is increasingly the playbook. So you have a situation where if you just allow the fighting to happen and you don't intervene, one side's going to win. But if you give the other side American air support, it will win. And this becomes the magic playbook that now, if you look around the world at places where the United States is most committed to trying to get an outcome, this is how it's done. In Ukraine, this is how it's done. In Syria, this was how it was done.
Mhm.
No large-scale troop deployment, so no big debate in the United States. No, oh, we're at war. Let's all talk about the fact that we're at war conversation. Doesn't take place because it happens with other people's troops. And the only real effect on American society is that the folks in the defense sector do well as a consequence of supplying the weapons to the
Right.
US military and to the militaries of the foreign states. So produces economic growth in the United States and no conversation about war.
Yeah, and then they, not to mention, they go into these regime changes without much of a plan as to how well, what comes afterwards. And part of probably why you see such lousy, like why the regime changes the US has facilitated have been such disasters is, one, there's not really like a constellation of forces that are coordinating to establish something after. Like there's not been many successful regime changes. I can only think of like really in Eastern Europe, like the post-Soviet ones like Solidarity, Poland,
The
and
color revolutions.
the color revolutions. And I mean that's because the, one lack of support for the government was so high, and you had also like the Catholic Church, you had the biggest Polish labor union against the government. I mean, you had powers that could coordinate as to what to do after. Like they had a plan. They're like, okay, well, we can maybe establish a representative competitive election system. In the case of Gaddafi, I mean, you look at Libya today, it's really just now a tribal hellscape.
Yeah,
And
this is an interesting one because
mhm.
in the case of in Venezuela, as the oil price tanks and you run out of money to sustain the social system, it's cheaper to just pay off the military with the oil money. You can still do that with the oil money past the point at which you can no longer sustain the broad poverty alleviation system. So as the poverty alleviation system goes to hell, you start dumping the money that you do have into the military
Which
to
is
keep the
what Maduro
military
has done.
tied to you.
Yeah.
Right. And then if you can convince the guys in the military that the rest of the world regards them as pariahs for having served in these military forces, and that the new regime will surely purge them from the military
Mhm.
and take away
Like
their jobs.
like they did with in Iraq and Saddam, and that led to, we know what that led to.
Right. So now the military is bound to the oil money. And
Mhm.
so you start with something that seems like it's an attempt to socialize the oil wealth, give it to the workers, use it to alleviate poverty, just becomes a system for giving the Praetorians a comfortable lifestyle amidst a country which is otherwise mostly non-functional. And that ends up being the outcome of something which began as a sincere effort by people who were poor to use oil money to immediately alleviate the serious consequences of poverty, something that nobody could possibly fault them for looking to do.
And the huge danger, right? So, yeah, Chavez could rely on the population to defend the revolution. Maduro relies on the military solely. And we saw that with the last election, which, they don't publish the exit polls. The reason why they don't do that is because if there's a very obvious discontinuity between the election results and the exit polls, it means it's rigged.
And this is after the
And
government having shut down the legislature, having done things that would shape the environment in which any poll would take place in such a way
banned a
that
bunch of
it would be
parties.
questionable on that basis. Yeah, ban a
And,
bunch of
yeah.
parties, all of that. In the
So you
case
get a
of Libya,
militocracy, right? So you get a militocracy, and then you also, I want to ask you about this. Does this tie into why the Venezuela, about, was it like a year ago or less than a year ago, they try to invade Guyana? That confused a lot of the kind of people who saw Venezuela as some kind of like anti-colonial, socialists, anti-imperialist. It really surprised a lot of people that they just went for this grab.
well, like
Uh,
Iraq did with Kuwait,
right. Does that have
because you
anything
get
to
to
do with
a resource
militocracy?
desperation
The oil
standpoint.
militocracy?
Yeah, if you're in a desperate resource position and you see an opportunity to grab resources from a small state, You think you might be able to pick this small state off before somebody comes and intervenes. The thing is, it's a risky thing to do because odds are somebody will show up and intervene if you do this, just like happened in the case of Kuwait. And the first Gulf War, the point of it was to demonstrate that small states can't be picked off by their medium-sized neighbors for the purposes of trying to go your own way and do your own thing without the support of the United States. Even in the case of Iraq, with a government that was put into power with a lot of support from the United States,
Yeah.
and which received a lot of support from the United States over
Chemical
time,
weapons
that
against
government
Iran.
was not permitted to pick off Kuwait and then use Kuwait's oil money to sustain its project.
Right.
But states will try this if they get really desperate, if they're in a very bad situation and they're very worried about their capacity to survive. They'll calculate that the risk is potentially something they can bear. If they do get pushed out, they can try to make the case that everything is because of the foreign powers. So this will often be the usual response, is to say that it's the Americans who have impoverished you by not permitting us to spend the oil money on you, because they won't make investments into our economy because we've spent the oil money on you. And that kind of argument can buy you a certain amount of time, but at the end of the day, what can you do with it? You can't go, there's no going forward from that position in a way which alleviates the situation or reduces the intensity of it. All you can do is buy time and hope that the oil price goes back up. That's all you can do. And sometimes that happens. In the case of Maduro, they caught a break during the Ukraine war and the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
The oil price came back up and it bought them some time.
And maybe that's also why they felt like they could get away with, taking parts of contested territory in Guyana. Is that driven by oil reserves? Because, when we talk about like states deciding things, I've never been a fan, actually. I know we use it for colloquial purposes, but often like the idea of, states can be a bit of a mystifying category, because it's like, who's, you know, if you think this is like a democratic regime, it means, oh, the people of Venezuela or whatever. But like the thing in Guyana seems so absurd that, I mean, it had to be driven by the militocracy, which is tied directly to oil at this point. Because it's
Yeah.
like, could it be that, like, I'm asking you to, explain this, that for the military, that's ultimately keeping Maduro in power. They have their interests, and they're probably suggesting to Maduro, if you want us to keep you in power, well, we want to do this over here. We see this opportunity here. You have to let us do it. Because you'd think,
Now,
if Maduro really had the choice, if he wants to present himself as this popular anti-colonial leader, he wouldn't really do something so blatant like a land grab of another Latin American neighbor
well,
which is a predominantly black country, I might add.
but they can make the
It's-
case that all of the borders are drawn up by the colonizer. And so the borders are just a kind of imperial cage that prevents them from expressing what's really new and generative about their new political project. There's a post-colonial argument that all of the borders are fake, and therefore they should create new borders, and military force is a mechanism potentially for doing it. They can make a rationale for it in terms
That's
of
what they
that
did.
theory,
Yeah.
and that is what they do. All the
That's
borders
a
are
lot
fake.
of big
Yeah.
problem in the Middle East, of course, which is why you got problem. Iraq and Syria couldn't even get along when they were both Ba'athist. And, people forget that, like, Muammar Gaddafi, he was probably about as successful as you can get as like these sort of post-colonial dictators. Invaded Chad.
What lets you do that in the case
Invaded
of Libya,
Chad
by
out
the
of
way?
nowhere. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. What let Libya run to the degree that Libya could run is that Libya's got very low population density, very low population relative to oil reserves. So in the case of Libya, it's possible to use the oil reserves to do a lot of poverty alleviation and still have money left over and still have some cush. So you can, to some degree, survive some of the ups and downs if you have a low enough population. And the most successful petrol states are the petrol states that preside over mostly desert countries with low populations that are huddled into a small number of cities on the coast that have way more oil wealth per capita than they could possibly use for poverty alleviation. Those states can do poverty alleviation, and then they still have oil money left over to do other things.
And
And
a lot
those
of
are the
foreign
states.
direct investment, we should add,
Yes, and
like the
and
Saudis,
they
the
can also
UAE,
make the
Qatar.
foreigners happy because they have so much oil money. They can alleviate poverty and make the foreigners happy. In the case of the Saudis also import a lot of workers who aren't in
Yeah, I was
position
about
to
to, yeah,
politically
about to say
struggle.
that.
Yeah,
They have
and
a
then
whole like
keep them as
underclass of migrants without citizenship that they exploit, basically.
yeah, yeah. So in the case of Saudi Arabia, there's that complicating feature, which is that they have an imported underclass that they use that has never been put into a position where it can politically struggle for its rights. But a lot of these other Gulf states, the Qatar and the UAE, have a lot of oil relative to the number of people who live in these countries. So it is possible in these states to do a lot of development and poverty alleviation and still have money left over. A lot of petrol states are not in that category. They have too many people. It's actually quite a significant lift to get those people out of poverty. It puts too much pressure on what the oil buys. And in the case of Venezuela, a lot of people don't know Venezuelan oil is infamously low quality. It's not popular oil. It's not oil that countries want to refine or want to use because it's mucky. So Venezuelan oil is the first oil that gets deprioritized. If the oil price is coming down, as soon as people can stop buying Venezuelan oil, it's the first kind of oil they're inclined to stop buying. This is the case even though Venezuela has a huge amount of it.
Yeah,
So you can have a
the
huge amount
biggest
of
oil
it.
reserves actually, in terms of
Right.
just size.
Yeah. But it's not popular oil because it's a pain to refine.
So on this question of regime change, maybe just to I'll lay my cards out just because for a lot of people who are less interested who are interested in the analysis, but sometimes just want to see like, do you support or oppose? I generally speaking, I'm very skeptical of regime change and I'm against it, but I do it in a way where, and I really urge people to do this, you can be against regime change without having to lie and delude yourself about what the Maduro regime is, which so many people do. They feel like they're the only way to defend against efforts to manufacture consent for regime change is to act like, this government is actually super popular, it has legitimate elections, it's helping the poor, it's socialist, whatever, anti-colonial, blah blah blah. And it's like, no, that's all crap. But I mean, for the simple reason of regime change, what I would say to the liberals who might like to point out all the human rights abuses and say, well, maybe it's good. And look, there's a lot of Venezuelans who believe in regime change. Very popular. It's why do you think Florida votes Republican? It's a big part of that. It's why Biden had to feel the need to keep the embargo on Cuba, unlike Obama, because he wanted to win Florida. That's how right-wing Floridans are, like a lot of the Latino population. They really hate these governments. Now, they might
Expat
want
syndrome.
regime change, but what I would say is, like, if you look at the results of attempts to do regime change, the US military industrial complex and the Pentagon does not necessarily, and probably does not, have the same intentions as a person who fled Venezuela has in establishing a democratic regime that's stable or whatever. A lot of the time, as we alluded to, there's various interests at play here, various interests. A big part of that is weapons manufacturing. Big part of it is big petroleum, as it was in the Iraq invasion, very clearly. Other foreign powers. There's different interests at play, and we should look at the outcomes. If the outcome is worse and more destabilizing, then it's probably not worth supporting. It's also in general like the biggest case too is like I feel like when people champion regime change for right reasons, that even if they're like morally good reasons, like this is Christopher Hitchens, right, back in the Iraq War, you just end up being kind of a useful idiot for a project to plunder a country with no plan to rebuild it. And that's often what it's been lately. But that brings us to the question, what do you think the Trump administration's strategy is? Because you said that they're not ready for ground forces, but what it does seem like as at the time we're recording this, the latest thing that seems to be happening is that the U.S. military is building up on Trinidad, right? They're doing military exercises in Trinidad, right by the Venezuelan border. And, they're striking down, prior to that, they were striking down all these ships of drug cartels, allegedly. So a lot of people are saying invasions is imminent. What could be their strategy here?
I think what they look to do is they look to put pressure on the regime and try to get a split in the military. So if there is a split in the military, if some part of the military defects to the opposition and some fighting begins, what they will then do is they'll intervene in the fighting to help the opponents of the regime from the sky and try to rapidly tip the balance in the rebels' favor so as to make it happen fast. So they don't have to wait for the entire military potentially to defect to try to get some peaceful color revolution. If even some part of the military is willing to defect, the United States will then intervene on behalf of the rebels and help the rebels win a civil conflict very fast, as opposed to allowing for something to potentially string out over years. The thing is, once they get the government out, they won't necessarily commit to doing anything to make the rebels stable. So in the case of Libya, for instance, they get rid of Gaddafi, and then they go, okay, it's up to you guys now. If you can make a government that's stable, then make one. But if you can't, there isn't going to be any further help. There aren't going to be ground troops to provide security for you. So what happens in Libya is that the initial civil war to get rid of Gaddafi is resolved very quickly because the United States intervenes from the sky on behalf of the rebels. But then after that, when the rebels splinter and start fighting among themselves, nobody comes to help. And Libya's per capita GDP was cut in half as a consequence of this. And it's still the case that there is a General Haftar in Cyrenaica in eastern Libya who set up his own informal regime that's not widely recognized, but is powerful enough that the Europeans sent a delegation to negotiate with him unofficially. And
You
this is
mentioned that last time, yeah.
more than 10 years later. It's still the case that in Libya, there's effectively two states that exist within the territory of Libya. Neither one of these states is very functional. And this is still going on because the interest was in getting rid of the dictator. It was not in committing long-term to a project of national rebuilding. And that could happen here. So, of course, the emphasis point for Maduro will be, you might not like me, but I am the only one who currently keeps the whole military together. And if you get rid of me, there's no telling what might then happen. Who knows how much worse the economic situation could get, or whether you'll actually be able to keep the military united as an instrument across time. The thing is, before Chávez, Venezuela did have some tradition of having elections. And before Gaddafi, Libya had a king. So there's a different history in Libya from Venezuela. Yep. And therefore, the Venezuelan opposition thinks of itself as having a different democratic history that it can draw on and potentially revive. So they have their image of what they'll be able to do. The thing about expats is that expats often are very optimistic about what will be possible after regime change takes place, in part because they don't live in the country anymore and aren't subject to the consequences of it.
Yep.
So their level of fear of what might happen is going to be greatly reduced relative to that of the people who live there and who will have to deal with whatever then happens. So their concern about order and the maintenance of order is much lower than that of the people who live there. And because they don't have to worry so much about order and so much about prosperity and being able to eat, they can get much more engaged with liberal ideals, and they can want to see it happen for the purpose of fulfilling liberal ideals. It's a very different kind of question if you actually live in one of these countries. You have been subject to the economic disruption that's taken place, but you found a way to survive it to this point. So however bad it is, you nonetheless are still alive. You found a way to feed your family. You found a way to not starve to death. Who knows what you've had to do to be able to do that, but you found a way. And now somebody is proposing to change things in a way that might make life even less predictable in ways that you are not necessarily accustomed to or have found a way to adapt to. It's a difficult question, but people in Venezuela will have to decide. What the United States will do is make life in Venezuela very hard to try to compel the Venezuelans to take action against the regime.
And that's the thing.
And then it will help them if they do.
Does that even work? Because I'm very skeptical about the strategy of sanctions, deter even working from the standpoint of like the imperialists. Because if you look at what seems to have happened in Iran, North Korea, Cuba, and Venezuela up till now, we'll see, is that it actually empowers the dictators more than it does compel the people to really revolt, because sanctions, create this environment of paranoia and allow a big justification for the government to crack down on opposition and any dissent. It's a lot harder, and you don't want to be seen, as a local and unpatriotic in helping the imperialists. So it's actually harder to really do anything. Not to mention that when you economically cripple a country, you also shrink the elite competition in some ways. Because while you might cause, a conflict at the top, what it really does is it shrinks the economy, which shrinks the amount of elites overall, and that just concentrates the elite in the state or in the main industry that it has. Because that's ultimately why, like, if you look at really like the countries that are built on extractive industries and have a very concentrated elite, they're against reforms to broaden the economy, because that means more elites that could rival their power.
Right, and this
So
is
it's
why
like,
you raised the Asa Magdalene Robinson book.
Like, do sanctions really work in doing that? Like, I don't think they do. I think they just make life worse. They also create refugee crisis, which then the right will complain about.
Yes, so it can go this way, and this is one of the ways in which it might go. The other set of examples that the other side would give are those Eastern European examples. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine. Cases where people in the countries rose up thinking that they would get some economic benefit ultimately from doing so. And in the case of some of those Eastern European countries, there's an argument that they did get an economic benefit. Why is it that the Ukrainians were willing to fight the Russians? Because they felt this would allow them to make a deal with the European Union, would allow them to get economic growth and development of the kind they have seen demonstrably Poland and Hungary and Czechia and Slovakia enjoy. So there's concrete evidence that sometimes does work for the people in the country if their goal is economic development. But this depends entirely on the degree to which the states in question have skin in it. So, for instance, when the Ukrainians signed over mineral reserves to the United States, the American argument is that actually this is to your benefit because it gives the Western states a greater stake in the country at the end of the war. Now, that can be the basis for creating a relationship of colonial extraction that keeps the country very poor. But very similar kinds of relationships also exist in those countries that have gotten rich by partnering with the West, like Poland, where there's military bases. You have to let NATO in. You have to let all of these things occur. And back when they were doing EU expansion and NATO expansion, there were those who argued that this could just result in anything. You might just allow them to pillage the country and milk it dry. And to some degree, they did pillage these countries and milk them dry. But then they also invested in them in ways that caused them to grow. The thing is that there's only so many countries that can be developed at once. There's only so much investment to go around, and there's only so many places where they can undertake these projects at any given time. You have to have a certain amount of confidence that you're going to be up in the queue. Why do they care about you? Why did they care about Poland and Hungary? And why did they prioritize those kinds of countries?
Migrants.
Because, and they're right next to the Western European states. They're right up there, right? Now, Venezuela's got some migrants. Venezuela's got some consequences that instability and disorder there potentially inflict on the United States. Does that mean that there would be real American commitment to developing Venezuela after a regime change situation takes place? such that it would turn out to be more like a Eastern European country and less like one of the other catastrophes. This is something where people in the country are having to roll the dice based on faith. And they really can't be sure what the outcome will be if you look back on it 20 or 30 years later. And what the Americans bet on is that if they make the situation bad enough and the president hasn't been able to consolidate military power completely or totally, like, for instance, Kim has in North Korea.
Yeah, the Kim dynasty.
Yeah. If there's still some possibility of a military split, that's what the Americans are looking to exploit. But if the military is completely tight around this regime, then it will survive. But if the military is completely tight around this regime, then that means that the oil wealth of the country will go to the military indefinitely, and that Venezuela will become a Praetorian petrol state, which doesn't have any kind of higher horizon for its people.
Yeah.
So it becomes, okay, you know that if you stick with Maduro, you get this, or you can roll the dice.
Right. Yeah.
And this is the situation that they put you in. And they think by putting you in this situation, you might choose to roll the dice. And historically, sometimes people do, and sometimes they don't, or they wait too long and the military consolidates around the leader and then it becomes impossible.
Yeah. So I can see why people think it's a dice roll that they're willing to take. Enough people, given that it is like, it's easy to say this will be another Iraq, but there's a few big differences. One, Venezuela has a history of democracy, not, the best one, but even under Chavez, there was elections, even though he concentrated power and stuff. But I mean, in the Chavez concentrated power really in the sense that Trump concentrates power. It wasn't like the clear rigging of elections yet, which we started to see more in recent Venezuelan history. With the other big difference is that the countries around Latin America have some semblance of democracy, in some cases, pretty effective democracy, right? And rule of law. In the previous history of Latin America, right? Because the U.S. intervention in Latin America has a horrific history, like installing
Yes.
all these dictatorships in Guatemala, Nicaragua, or attempted in Nicaragua, in Guatemala, Argentina, Brazil, murderous Chile, murderous dictatorships that just committed some of the worst crimes against humanity ever.
Right.
Really bad history. Now, those dictatorships got overthrown largely through, democratic movements from below. And if you look at, and also this big reason the U.S. allowed this to kind of happen is because of lack of Soviet threat there. They were like, okay, we don't care to prop up these anti-communist dictatorships anymore. So you had democratization.
And in many cases, the democracies cooperated with the Americans to allay concern that in overthrowing these dictators, they were going to do something that would be a problem. In the case of Venezuela and a couple other places, it went beyond that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that in the case of even they either cooperated with the U.S. or just went their own way and didn't cause problems. So like AMLO in 2003, that's when he actually got the election rigged against him. But when he came into power, was it 2015? Yeah, AMLO, the kind of, left populist government of Mexico, which now has the successor Claudia Sheinbaum. They're kind of part of this new pink tide, but they haven't gone on the UN and said that the president of the United States is the devil and that, encouraging other countries to revolt against the empire. They've kind of
kept it soft.
There's a level. They kept it low key.
Right.
Yeah, they avoided
about
they hid their GTA stars, to use a boomer term, a zoomer term. They kept their power levels lower, as they say. Lula too, to some extent. Lula was also not confrontational with the U.S. But at the same time, Lula and Gustavo Petro have declined to participate in the U.S. in a U.S. project to use their military to help topple Venezuela. They've declined to do that.
Right. There's a range of relationships that the United States permits in Latin America. You have some level of choice about what form it takes, but only some, only up to a point. You don't have to be Colombia.
Right. But it does show there's more independence in Latin America than there was before. At the same time, Chavez, while he used to be part of this, Chavismo was associated with the pink tide. Maduro is not. Maduro is actively disliked by much of the other pink tide leaders, to the point where actually Lula, Gustavo Petro, Gabriel Boric all questioned the legitimacy of the last election. Briefly, even AMLO,
Makes
who's
them look
probably
bad.
even AMLO, who is the most sympathetic, actually, in being against interfering in Venezuela, momentarily actually, said that, Maduro should probably publish the exit polls, but then also followed up by saying, no, we should not be for involving in Venezuela. But you could tell he was skeptical. Even he was
Yeah,
skeptical.
because the right in those countries compare them and claim that because
Yeah.
they oppose regime change in Venezuela, their plan is to make their countries like
Like
Venezuela.
Venezuela, yeah.
So Maduro is a negative example that is continuously used in Latin American politics to inconvenience these other guys.
Right. And the distancing themselves from that has actually been effective to a large degree. In the talking points among the Mexican right to compare AMLO and Shane Baum to saying they're going to make us like Venezuela have not worked, right? In fostering opposition at any successful degree. And I mean,
One of
in
the reasons
Colombia
for
is
that is that these
remarkable
other
too.
countries are not petrol states in the way that
Yeah.
Venezuela is.
Yes.
So they don't have the same internal dynamic.
In Colombia, it's pretty remarkable that the left populists have even been able to win in Colombia, given that Colombia had probably one of the most ferocious right-wing oppositions ever, given that you had a constellation of a far-right US-backed with the cartels often against the left populists. And the cartels in Colombia are another level, another ball game.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. They have the power of full-on government militaries. It's, they would
You
give the
have
US Marines trouble.
lawless ports that are governed by cartels, entire ports that are, messy stuff, to be sure.
We have to remember the Mexicans tried a war on terror to fight the cartels, and they gave up.
And it's in part because the cartels become
can't.
very embedded in the government. They end up with all sorts of ties and relations such that you can't really tell, is a cartel a paramilitary group, right? But then, once you get to a stage where you don't potentially need to rely on cartels to prop up governments, then it becomes possible to potentially have a more robustly anti-drug position. If you've got other kinds of economic development that you can support. But to get to that stage, it takes a lot of time, and you have to make a priority of developing particular states. And the priority has never been on Latin America, in part because there isn't much competition in Latin America for the United States. The United States has not really been concerned at any point in its history, with the exception of the Cuban Missile Crisis, of a serious security threat in Latin America.
The
And
Monroe
therefore, Latin
Doctrine.
American states are never at the front of the line for getting seriously developed.
Because of the Monroe Doctrine, ever since then, Latin America has been seen by the United States as their backyard. And they, as you said, haven't had much of a real threat. And that's why even the Soviet Union didn't mess around in Latin America very much.
Certainly after the Roosevelt corollary, right?
Right.
So there was, of course, the Mexican-American War in between the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt corollary, and the Spanish-American War. But
Yeah,
after
today was
those
about that.
events, there really wasn't any kind of substantial security competition out there.
So
The Argentinians, up until the First World War, received a ton of investment from Europe. A lot of Western European states tried to have influence in Latin America through Argentina. And once those states became unable to sustain that level of investment, the Argentinian economy stagnated. And Argentina has never been given a high priority by the United States, in part because Argentina is associated with those European countries. Argentina has this kind of longstanding position in South America of being the country that's most vulnerable to potential adversary investment from Europe. And all the Nazis in Argentina stuff is directly connected with that and with that legacy, all of the stories and theories about Nazis in Argentina.
So one debate that I've been seeing within the MAGA movement is they seem quite divided as to whether this invasion's a good idea, because of course the MAGA movement prided itself on being anti-war, unlike other Republicans. And Trump said no new wars, and he's gotten in the U.S. involved with Iran, and the Israeli policy has been increasingly not popular with the MAGA base. With Venezuela, they seem more divided. Many are against it. Some see it as just, oil interests, nothing that really helps America. Some are rationalizing it as good because it's in the U.S. interest, because it's their backyard, and because ultimately taking the talking points of Washington itself, that Venezuela is, dangerously close with the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians. They made a trade deal with Iran a few years ago or less, maybe a year ago. What are the interests of the Pentagon? What do they see as the benefit of, doing what they're doing right now?
Well, Venezuela, I don't think is too large a concern with regard to China. Yes, in principle, China will say things supportive of Venezuela, but I think the general consensus is that the Chinese regard Maduro as a non-serious person, not somebody they can effectively partner with in a more substantive kind of way. But of course, the Chinese will happily use any American intervention in Venezuela to accuse the Americans of operating the international system in an unjust way. So the rights of Venezuela as a sovereign state will be something that at a rhetorical level, China will defend. But will China commit military forces to Venezuela? Will China try to use Venezuela to fight a proxy war with the United States? I don't think that is the case. I don't think the Chinese military is interested in something like that. In terms of, I think there is concerns about refugees and immigration. I think the Trump administration shares the Biden administration view that until something is done about Maduro, it's difficult to turn away Venezuelan nationals. Because the United States has repeatedly suggested that, well, get rid of the Maduro regime, and then not done that. So there are all of these Venezuelan nationals who at one time or another have taken action on the basis that they think the Americans are going to help them out. And that has not materialized. And these people will have a claim to asylum status by law in the United States. And they'll have a credible case whether there is a formal invitation for them to come or whether they nonetheless come and make asylum claims. It's going to be hard to say no to them. And in principle, the set of people in Venezuela who may have taken action on the basis of thinking that the Americans would help, this can be, even anybody who shows up at the polls and votes against Maduro, has taken political action that potentially puts them in danger. And certainly they could make that kind of case in an asylum-seeking setting in the United States. So I think there are immigration concerns that give them an interest in trying to get regime change, and some of the same regular kinds of concerns that they've had at many points about oil, and also about making sure that there is no example in Latin America of a highly successful state that's regarded as anti-American. There can be states which deploy a certain amount of social democratic policy, but those states cannot be seen to be anti-American. They can't create an appearance that there's a viable path in Latin America that is oppositional to the United States. So I think for that reason, they're keen to make sure that insofar as Maduro's regime continues, it looks bad and is a negative example. And then if they can apply pressure to the Maduro regime and get a regime change to happen that doesn't involve them deploying ground troops, then they would gladly do that. But I think once you get to the stage of going, it might be able to happen, but only if there are American ground troops. At that point, the appetite would not be enough to take it that far. Similar to the operation in Iran. The operation in Iran is drones. It's from the sky. It doesn't involve a large deployment of U.S. troops for any significant length of time. If there were any U.S. troops involved, it was special operations, very quick in and out. Not something that would involve potentially having to ask Congress for authorization. Not something, therefore, that's likely to get a lot of media attention in the United States, apart from in elite quarters. So elites in the United States have paid a lot of attention to this. But if you go to issue polling and ask Americans what are the important issues facing the country, if there aren't troop deployments, if you don't have poor working class Americans who enlist in the military for economic reasons being deployed, you won't see the issue become very important in polling. And this is the case for Israel-Palestine. It's the case for Ukraine. There's no polling footprint when you ask the American public what are the important issues in the upcoming election. And you don't prop them by asking them, what do they think about Gaza or what do they think about Ukraine? You just ask them, what are the issues you care about? You don't see large parts of the population mentioning these foreign policy issues because there's no troop deployment. And this is something that the administration grasps. It has a much freer hand, provided it can avoid troop deployment, not just legally, but also politically in terms of how will the American public respond to the activity.
And that's the paradox, though, is lack of troop deployment and relying on air strikes to, like, destabilize, whatever forces would try to defend the regime, and empowering whoever opposes it is a big risk in actually having a sort of anarchy. And I wonder, like, Venezuela, the fact that it has, like, a history of democracy, it also has states around it that have shown themselves capable of having multi-party elections. That makes the prospects a little more hopeful, but there's also the drug cartel problem where, despite the Trump's posture to, like, be all against drug cartels, it's very possible that, cartels would use this as an opportunity to,
Yes.
seize
No,
more
to some degree,
control.
I think the administration is happy to have cartels potentially viewing this as an opportunity, because since at least in their minds, they think of the Venezuelans as the Venezuelan government as a drug cartel. That language has been used by members of the administration, that it's not a government, it's a criminal organization. If they think that way, then competing drug cartels that look at this as an opportunity to potentially move in on Venezuelan territory are potential allies in a struggle for changing things out.
Mhm.
And
Which
I
is
do
not
think
good
that
for Venezuela,
sometimes,
in
yeah,
my view.
no, but I do think that sometimes the United States looks at drug cartels as both adversaries and potential tools.
Sure. I mean, well, it certainly did in Nicaragua, right? It backed the drug cartels against the Sandinistas. And that's a whole
Because they're
controversial.
not
Yeah.
ideological. And the thought is if they're not ideological and they just want to get rich and enjoy luxuries, then they'll be responsive to standard kinds of capitalistic incentives.
I mean, there's a whole crazy history of, like, deep state collaboration with cartels. I mean, it's documented a lot in Peter Dale Scott's work when he talks about, the underworld of, geopolitics. There's a lot of cooperation between, so one reason why collaboration with drug cartels is often a thing is because sometimes foreign intelligence agencies like the CIA, or secret intelligence agencies like the CIA, don't want things to be on the books that they're doing. Like, they don't want to have any proof of certain activities. So they use money that is cash, and a way to do that is through drug cartels. It's a way to get involved in activities without having official state funds be used for certain projects. And you get all that stuff, and that's a whole another can of worms. But it's like, when it comes to if there is regime change in Venezuela, like, because I don't want to like act like there is no possibility of Venezuela being better without Maduro. I mean, there just is. I would say even
Of course
the
there
same,
is.
especially the case with Iran. It's a different case because Iran has a civil society in a way that Iraq doesn't exactly. You know, they
It's
have,
possible. It's
yeah,
just you have to bear in mind that the United States will not guarantee that outcome. The
no,
United States will help rebels to
yeah.
win, and then it will cut them loose and leave them to figure it out. And so it therefore so much depends on the opposition and the quality of the organization around the opposition. And part of giving the Nobel Peace Prize to the democracy activists in Venezuela is
Mm.
to try to suggest that there's a viable person they could potentially rally around. But just because you get the Peace Prize because you've been picked out as somebody who people can rally around does not mean it will work out if they do in fact do that thing. We all know about, well, maybe we don't all know, but what happened in Burma, in Myanmar, with they gave the Nobel Peace Prize to a democracy activist in Myanmar, and then she took power in the country and then tried to stay in power in ways that caused the Nobel Committee to feel bad about having given her the Peace Prize.
Are you referring to the Muslims, the killing of Muslims with the
So,
Buddhists?
yes, that there was religious conflict and then also struggle with the military. And the difficult thing is in a country like Myanmar, it's very hard to govern the country without the support of organizations which will potentially demand you do things that, if you do them, will cause you to look bad internationally. And yet, if you don't do these things, then your ability to stay in power purely on the basis of things like democratic mandates is questionable. And when you have, a large consolidated military apparatus that is much better organized than anything else in the society, and the reason that Myanmar is typically run by a military junta is that this is the case there, you are going to have a very difficult time using elections to secure legitimacy, because those elections will not necessarily mean you have the support of the most powerful, best organized thing that exists within the territory. It's only in countries where the military respects the election that can be the case. And why does the military respect the election? Because the military has realized in most of these countries that if it tries to rule without the election, it won't work. Either the military comes to believe it doesn't have the economic competence to run the country, or it comes to believe that it doesn't have the political competence to secure legitimacy without the aid of the civilian administration. These civil military relations questions are very, very important and never get enough attention. And the things that you have to do because you are in a country that has bad civil military relations, nobody ever wants to accept them.
Yeah. I was thinking Pakistan there. It's a country that never quite was able to adopt democratic elections because of how powerful the military was. And when the military doesn't like the elections, they make the guy step down, as we saw with
Yeah. And in
Imran Khan.
Pakistan, the country is right next to India. India is at this point much bigger and stronger in conventional terms than Pakistan. So Pakistan is in a situation where it's in a military competition. It's fated to lose because of its inferior size. And therefore, it leans on its military to preserve this sense of security for it. And this makes it very difficult for Pakistan to go away from its military because there's the immediate fear that India will exploit this. Of course, Pakistan has nuclear weapons, which also gives them some bulwark against any excesses, but only excesses, only in quite existential cases. In smaller scale cases, India can press pretty hard at this stage because Pakistan is so much weaker. Having lost Bangladesh and then having grown economically at a slower pace and having to deal with also the Taliban. And that's the other reason that the military in Pakistan is a big deal. The military in Pakistan also keeps out the Taliban. Or it's supposed to. It can be discredited by failing to do that.
When it comes to how people talk about Venezuela, one thing that I think will be relevant to the audience, and you saw with some tweets that I made in the interesting reactions to some of them, I noticed that like I can say that I oppose U.S. intervention and I oppose even sanctions. And if I criticize Maduro, I am seen as helping imperialism. Now, this is interesting because I want to help encourage listeners to talk about this in a way that doesn't make you look like a fool, because I noticed this is like people on the left, and I thought this was a modern thing, but the more I've talked to Chris Catrone, he tells me this was a thing with the far left during the Iraq War, actually, kind of a problem in how people talk about this. There's this sort of magical thinking that, like, if you point out any problems with Maduro, you're seen to be manufacturing consent for a war versus Venezuela. First of all, it overestimates the degree of power like leftist influencers have in anything.
It's also
Second
it's
thing,
tied
but
to an old vision about how this conflict works. There's an assumption, and it's a pre-70s assumption, that the military intervention can only happen with the deployment of U.S. ground troops, and therefore some sort of public debate in the United States in which American society agrees to commit ground troops for this purpose. But that isn't how this is likely to happen.
no,
If it
we
does
don't have.
happen,
Yeah,
won't involve some big social debate within the United
no.
States in which American society either comes to a consensus or doesn't with regard to Venezuela. That's not how it will go.
That's a really good point because the way we talk about war and manufacturing consent is kind of as if we're still in the Vietnam sort of situation where there's conscription. And if you have
Yeah.
conscription, there's the public actually has a lot of power in determining whether people stay in the war because that's their livelihoods are tied up into it. They're more likely to oppose it, whereas it's just, you know,
It's
people.
multiple levels now because we've gotten rid of the conscription, and then we've also, to a substantial degree, stopped even deploying the volunteer military
Mhm.
into countries where regime change is attempted. So, now we don't even do the Iraq or Afghanistan thing. That is regarded as politically, you don't want to go there. So once you won't conscript your population and you won't deploy large numbers of your all volunteer military to a territory, the part of society that has a stake in whether the conflict takes place, a real serious stake, is much reduced and becomes mainly people who have something to gain as opposed to people who have something to lose, because it becomes mainly the engineers and the tech sector people. They're the ones who will be affected by whether it happens.
Not to
Nobody
mention,
else really will.
not to mention is that, the people don't vote for war anymore. I mean, back in the day, you had to vote for war credits. Like the SPD had to like ultimately be there to co-sign Germany's war effort, under
Yeah.
friggin' the
Look at
Kaiser.
defense
Look
spending
at
as a percentage of GDP. It has stayed near the post-Cold War low level. It came up a little bit during Iraq and Afghanistan, but as a percentage of US GDP, military spending has remained very, very low compared with the Cold War level. So it's also not the case that there's an obvious budgeting question even that comes out of this.
right.
So the US military is buying new missiles and drones
They're
continuously all
never
the
concerned
time.
about budget all the time when it comes to, the deficit with the military. It doesn't matter because, the government's happy to accept MMT when it comes to the military because they understand that it's tied to productive capacity and that it's tied to the building and making of things. So it doesn't really, at that point, the currency is for provisioning and it's tied to the GDP. It's, producing things, even if it's, bombs that kill people and destabilizing countries, it's still like economically beneficial. So they don't, care about deficits and whatever for that.
And you get to a point where they have large stockades of, old stuff that at this point it would cost them money also to keep it or sustain it. We're using it before it becomes completely outmoded, becomes a cost-saving measure in some cases. The way that you think about how the military operates, something like a Patriot missile seems like a really expensive thing to use until you consider that at this point, if you were to replace the Patriot missile, you'd replace it with newer, better, different technology. You would not buy more Patriot missiles. You would buy something else that would be better. And indeed, getting rid of your Patriot missiles means that you have a reason to invest in getting something better than them for your next use. So it's not as if you go through some of this old ammunition, it's going to be a problem for them. And a lot of the old ammunition has maintenance costs that they're happy to avoid. Upshot of all of this is that this can be done relatively cheap at this point. It doesn't have the kind of very obvious financial costs that, say, Vietnam had, or to a lesser extent, Iraq and Afghanistan, because of how this is being done now. So it doesn't have the physical footprint. It doesn't have a conscription footprint. It doesn't even involve your volunteer military being deployed in any large number for any length of time. So the reasons for people to care whether the United States does this are overwhelmingly moral rather than economic or substantively political in character. And therefore, the argument becomes a mainly elite argument, which takes place increasingly on university campuses and within the bureaucracy. It ceases to be something which engages broad parts of society. So not only does the left have limited influence over what society thinks, does, says, wants, it's not just that the left is a small or weak or disorganized part of society, and arguments can be made to that effect, of course. This is not really even a social question at this stage. These kinds of military operations aren't social questions and don't require the consent of society to happen.
Or even arguably Congress.
Well, of course, not Congress, obviously not Congress.
Which is the most democratic branch of government that the U.S. still has. Does not really, it's not up to them as to what happens. It's the
and they could go and pass legislation that would reassert a role. Constitutionally, they're entitled to do that, but they don't believe that
president can
actually be effective.
Well, the president can also block Congress. Another big problem with the American
he has
system.
A veto.
Yeah,
he has a veto, but that veto can be overridden if Congress is determined to reassert its rights. But Congress is not determined to reassert this right, because even if Congress doesn't like the particular way in which the war powers are being used at this particular juncture, Congress doesn't believe that it's competent to exercise these powers itself. Why doesn't Congress think that? Well, some of it is that the individual members in Congress don't know enough about foreign policy to feel confident that they could make these decisions. They don't have access necessarily to full intelligence of the kind that's available to people inside the executive branch. They get briefed like fancy journalists a lot of the time. But also some of it is that in real time, there are opportunities that the president has to carry out strikes that are time sensitive, that happen really fast.
Yeah.
And if the president has to get authorization for each one of those, it just takes too long. If you have to go to an assembly and have a deliberation each time, it just takes too long. So what happens is that Congress will at most set up a kind of high-speed court that treats this like a search warrant that you have to get.
Right.
And then that high-speed court, it'll be a judicial technocratic mechanism. It won't actually be the democracy.
And also the way a lot of the
decision.
funding seems to occur is these big bills that involve funding for all kind of other things that are tied up into the programs a lot of these representatives promise to their constituencies, but conveniently what's thrown in is funding for, like, let's say Israel or Ukraine. And, it's like you have to vote on this bill, even though it has funding for Israel in it, because or else, you might, the economy of the place you represent might hurt. You know,
Yeah, and they
sometimes they
don't
might
even
not
have
even
to do it
care
that
to
way.
really. Sometimes they might not even care to even read what's there, all of what's in the bill. You know, there's increasingly really these complex bills that just are filled with so much stuff in them. They're very difficult to understand. It's confusing to a lot of people when you see, like, for example, AOC voting on a bill that includes Israel funding, or like funding something very specific. I remember it was like for Israeli drones, right? It was just like that was just thrown into this big legislation, right? Or there was the big beautiful bill, Trump's thing, which has funding for all kind of things, but then also just tons of ICE funding, right?
Yeah. Oh,
So
loads of ICE funding.
yeah.
Yeah. I think it tripled the ICE budget. Big pile of money for ICE in the large omnibus bill. But yeah, and the thing is, if people didn't vote to give the funding directly to Ukraine or directly to Israel, there are other ways that they could get these weapons to these states. These states could receive it on credit. There are other ways that potentially this kind of thing can be done. The mechanism of having this state get money from the government and then that state pass that money to our military contractors. This is a particular accounting mechanism that makes the transaction look clean to some people. But there are other ways you could do that transaction that wouldn't be done that way. Indeed, the regular defense spending gives our military a huge amount of weapons that it has that aren't indexed to any purpose. The regular defense spending authorization bills, they allow our military to have a huge amount of permanent resources that aren't tied to any particular use. And the president can then decide to use these
Yes.
things on the basis of the war powers and on the basis of the counterterrorism legislation. They aren't indexed to a particular use. Congress doesn't say, oh, by the way, the tanks can only be used for these things in the legislation. No, there's funding in general for this equipment. And then that equipment is available for the executive to use in accordance with the powers.
So all this is to say that basically whether or not we criticize Maduro doesn't play a role in
Makes
any
no difference.
makes no
And this is in
difference.
part why our conversations,
What does
in the West are so bad about these issues, because the quality of the discussion doesn't matter. We could spend an enormous amount of time getting informed about all the little details, and none of it would make any difference to the ultimate outcome or the decision that would be taken in these cases. The government is going to make this decision based on a set of elite concerns that are economic and geostrategic in character. And it's not going to have anything to do with general moral opinion. It's not going to matter.
which leads to the question, I mean, what does matter about these discussions? And I think it's what can you change in your country, and what at least the least you can do is talk about this in an informed way that doesn't make you look like a fool. And that's what I kind of worry is the people who make their whole personality being a sort of like anti-imperialist, and in reality they're powerless. So what they do is end up doing propaganda for the regimes that the America opposes. And it's like there's a point you can do that, which by being just like a truthful journalist, and then there's also a way you can do that by just being a propagandist for that regime, which some people do. You often intentionally, sometimes just because they're idiots.
And sometimes there's funding for it
Sometimes
from
there's funding for it. I
states in
honestly think a
question.
lot of it's voluntary.
Yeah, a lot of it is just people, because they feel like they can't make any difference in their country, they like to imagine that somewhere else there are other people who are doing something, and that they can be in solidarity with those people, and by doing that, accomplish something. But operates based on a fanciful notion of their level of influence over events, of the left's influence over events, of the importance of the left and the left's activity. And I think really just it's based on ways of thinking about what the ordinary citizen's role is in foreign policy and in warfighting that are so anachronistic now and just so dated.
Yes, very dated.
And so much of left activity is like this. So much of it is predicated on society operating and political decisions being taken within particular procedural mechanisms, operate on particular timescales that involve deliberative mechanisms. And these things, they don't operate to anything like the same degree. And insofar as they still do operate, their connection with decisions has become very frayed. There's a lot of talking shops now that don't really have any connection to the decisions that are being taken.
Right. It's like also, you shouldn't participate in electoral politics ever because that makes no difference. There's no difference between any party or whatsoever. I'm so
But you
radical.
should talk about
But you
all
should
of this
also
stuff
talk,
all the
but
time.
also like talking about the regime is somehow going to like make a difference in the policy. It's really contradictory thinking. But what people who are, the public yappers, thought leaders, whatever, okay, intellectuals, they have power over their own perception. And the thing is like, unless your whole profit model is selling a sort of fantasy or fad to people or an escapism, then it just makes you really look like a fool to like spread outward lies about a country, to just in the name of defending against imperialism, right? Like I see some people say this, try to do this with North Korea, it's truly fascinating to see. Now, what is a good way to talk about this? Because, like, look, regular people, we don't have like a power in changing the policy. But I do wonder what would be a good way to talk about this if one was in Congress or had the prospects of being elected to the presidency, or was able to advise the presidency, had an ear. How would one convince people at the elite level to take a different route? Now, I think that's interesting to even think about because that challenges us to think of governance. Because, you know, on the right, there's this debate. It's like, is it in our interest to be in Venezuela? No, it's not in our interest. Yes, it's our backyard. But like, okay, if this is the basis of it being our interests, I can think of a compelling argument as to why sanctions are not good for even the US interests or anyone's interests. And look, maybe this is my bias to kind of classical liberal thinking sometimes, but it's that, look, the sanctions, for one, they interfere into a sort of more natural state of the economy. It prevents the natural formation of elite competition, which I think is more healthy and better for the development of society, civil society, the economy. Sanctions are bad for the economy, so it makes a country less democratic and empowers dictators, centralized power, and it's bad for people, and also creates a lot of imbalances in migration patterns. Like, ultimately, I think one of the single-handedly best cases you can make to people all across the spectrum against foreign intervention is all the refugee crises it exacerbates, like with the Syria, backing the anti-Assad forces. Ultimately, like that was what helped propel the Syrian refugee crisis. And, who complains about that? The right. I mean, everyone really, well, people across the board complain about it. So it's like, if you want to actually deal with these issues, you should be against foreign intervention. Also, even if you're in the name of fighting democracy, what evidence do we really have that like democracy has been spread? Really, like when it comes to the West spreading democracy, it's really only the fall of the Soviet Union. You at most you can make that happened, and that you know was where they took a more hands-off approach, honestly, in terms of like direct, troops on the ground or anything. There's little evidence that like this kind of neocon fantasy has
You
ever
have to do it
worked.
with the military. The fact that you have to do it with the military seems to indicate that there's a lack of something that has to be filled in. And once you fill it in with the military, won't you just have to continue filling it in with the military? And why would the military help you transition to a less military oriented system?
If you've been enjoying this podcast so far, I highly recommend you become a patron. This is where you get access to the second half of all my podcasts. You get access to this one, over 80 exclusive episodes, and the Discord, where I have some interesting discussions with the people who listen to this regularly. In the back room, Benjamin and I get deeper into the question of Palestine, anti imperialism more broadly, And what constitutes politics? And how do you differentiate it from pseudo-activity? What kind of people does politics attract? Nerd brain questions we love to talk about. So we'll see you there, and thank you for listening.
Thank you.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.